if you're in a position where your health depends on meat and you've got limited resources, you have to put your own mask on first. If I think back to kind of mental state that I was in before I found carnivore, I was dysfunctional. There's no way I could have made a positive impact on the world. It was hard enough for me to just live my day-to-day life. There's a bit of a bootstrapping thing where you have to get your nutritional elements in place however you're going to get them before you worry about just iteratively, one step at a time, make it better.
Welcome to the Gene Food Podcast. I'm your host, John O'Connor. Hey guys, today we are going to cover a very controversial topic in the nutrition world. A lot of you have probably heard about the carnivore diet. It's gaining in popularity. There's a lot of marketing behind the carnivore diet. A lot of people swear by it. There's some very famous and well-known public figures out there who have put autoimmune disease into remission eating nothing but meat. Here at Gene Food, we don't necessarily think that the carnivore diet is for everybody or maybe even for most people. I think there's a lot of health challenges associated with eating that way over the long term. Having said that, we wanted to have a nuanced discussion about the carnivore diet to try to get the perspective of somebody who the diet has helped. So we brought on Amber O'Hearn. Amber is one of the original movement generators of the carnivore diet. She started the Carnivore Diet Conference, and she's been blogging and researching the carnivore diet for a number of years. We were really excited to talk to Amber, mainly because we were able to have a nuanced discussion surrounding a diet that I think is very polarizing. We talked about when the carnivore diet can be a healthy intervention. There's some genetic circumstances that we've identified that we think could point people in a diet that was more carnivorous. And we also talked about the concerns that we have and the times when we think a carnivore diet could potentially be suboptimal for people's health as well. So if you're in the mood for a deep dive and a more nuanced conversation about the carnivore diet, we get into a lot of the science, cholesterol, lipids, uric acid, all that good stuff. So without further ado, here is Amber. I'm so fascinated by just the topic of the carnivore diet and all the stories and all the characters that are involved in the carnivore diet. And I was going to try to make it out to your conference because you're the founder of the Carnivore Diet Conference, which is cool. I ended up not being able to make it, and you were very pleasant about refunding my ticket, so I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, it's funny because I was just looking up in my email to find the number for this conference call and noticed that when I put in your name, a refund request came up, and I hadn't put the two together until just now.
Yeah.
But I hope you get a chance to come to the next one. I'm actually really excited about it. I'm really glad that I put that together because there's so many people talking about the carnivore diet, and there's a set of people who are just really enthusiastic about it but don't have a very good understanding of what's going on with it scientifically. And there are people who are advocating for it without really just saying things that go beyond the evidence. And what I really wanted to achieve with this conference is to reel it back in and say, hey, what do we actually know? What do we not know? What do we want to know more about? And what's going on in the scientific basis of this? I wanted to rescue it from what I saw was this over enthusiasm. It happens with everything. Just to figure out what of value we can take from what we've learned so far, and what's the right direction to go forward to get the most value out of what we know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I had in my notes to discuss with you is it's funny to watch in the diet wars, the kind of the desire to sort of like win, because it's crazy to watch. I mean, we have this election cycle that's coming up, and with the diet wars, it gets the same. I mean, you get people like to be part of a group, and they like to affiliate with a group, and I feel like it probably something having to do with like social media algorithms or just the way that our news feeds are kind of curated by the people that we subscribe to and follow on Twitter and the conversations that we take part in. And you have these literally opposite conversations taking place. You have these plant-based groups that are having conversation A, and they are just totally dismissive of and skeptical of any of the low-carb stuff. And then the low-carb stuff is exactly the same with the plant-based group. And it's all this crossfire. And what we're interested in doing is trying to come up with some frameworks. So it's like, okay, if this is something that you're struggling with, or you have this lab marker that's showing this, then you might want to consider a carnivore diet. We're going to get into some of that here in a minute. But before we do, I just think your story is so interesting. So if you could just kind of tell the audience how you came to be a follower of the carnivore diet, why, what a typical day looks like for you, eating wise, and all that good stuff.
Sure. Yeah. And I just wanted, before I go into that, really reiterate what you just said about the desire to win. And it seems almost like people are more worried about their status and about being right than actually creating value, which is, of course, what we all want to do ultimately. So I actually grew up on a primarily vegetarian diet. So my mother, she didn't grow up vegetarian, but when she got to be a teenager, she decided that for ethical reasons, she couldn't participate in this direct taking of another life, another animal life, particularly mammals, in order to eat. And so we were brought up vegetarian, and I think in a really good way as far as vegetarianism goes, in part because we were pretty poor. And so most of what we lived off was legumes and grains that were properly soaked, and because we didn't buy stuff that was pre-made, we had to do it all at home. So I grew up on home-baked bread, and we had books on our shelves about how to properly compose a diet to make sure you combine proteins properly and all that stuff. We did have eggs and dairy at our home, and even occasionally fish, and maybe even more rare, some poultry. And it wasn't that I didn't have any meat at all growing up, because when I went to my grandparents, I wasn't forbidden from eating that way. It's something my mother wanted to support in her own kitchen. So that was my upbringing, and that was my bias growing up. So when I went to live on my own as a teenager, I did eat meat, and I was also very financially constrained. I basically ate what I could get my hands on. And when I went to university, my circumstances changed a bit, because I started dating someone who had the means to feed me. And so I just started eating a lot.
Get some steaks here. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and actually steak wasn't, because it wasn't something I grew up with, it was never something that I really chose. It's not that I avoided meat, but a meat-focused meal just wasn't the kind of meal that I would have chose, because it just wasn't what I was used to.
Sure.
But I ate a lot, and I gained 30 pounds in probably the first 6 months of my university experience, which was really distressing to me for a variety of reasons. And so I thought, okay, I've got to fix this. And I had the idea in my mind that diet and exercise were the way to go. I don't know where I got that idea. But so I started looking into diet a bit, and this was 1992. So we didn't have the World Wide Web, but we did have the internet, and there were discussion groups online. And the two big diet discussion groups were actually a low-fat discussion group and a low-carb discussion group. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of low-carb. I looked at it for, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or something, but I pretty much immediately dismissed it as the craziest thing I'd ever heard of. Like, why would you throw away the foundational base of our diet where all our health comes from? And I just there were too many barriers for me to even understand why it might be okay. And eventually I decided that the reason maybe that I had gained all this weight was because of my diversion from my vegetarian upbringing. So I immediately went vegetarian again and started exercising a lot. And this may have actually stalled my weight gain, but it didn't cause any weight loss. And so then I decided I should eliminate all animal products from my diet. So I did have a stint of pure veganism, all of that stopped when I went on a trip to Russia as part of my studies.
Hmm.
And I could have, I think, if I cared about it enough, like if it were an ethical position that I was taking, I might have taken more steps to just continue to do that while I was there. But because it was so difficult, and because I thought, all right, this experience of being in this other country will be enhanced by my eating the way people are eating here, and I can put my own health concerns on hold until I get back home. And what actually happened was that when I got home, I had lost some weight.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a variety of reasons that might have happened that might have had nothing to do with adding meat back into my diet. Like, for example, I drank a lot of vodka
Okay.
and I probably just did different things.
You probably also just kind of stopped worrying about it too for a while. I feel like getting so deep in the weeds on the concern over just eating the perfect diet is kind of part of the problem with the whole diet issue in the first place, right? I mean,
That's a really good point. Yeah. So I just wanted to emphasize, I don't really think that adding some meat back into my diet caused the weight loss, although it might have been the case that I was protein deficient, for example.
mm-hmm.
But what happened was it caused me to rethink. It caused me to say, okay, something about my whole conception of this must be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And something made me think about the low carb diet again. I don't know why I thought of it. The seed had been planted a while ago, as I said, but it happened that in that year, 1997, the book Protein Power by Dr. Mary Dan and Michael Eads came out. And so I saw that on the bookshelves and I read that book, and that completely changed my life. And that's when I started a low carb diet back in 1997.
Okay.
But my low carb diet was very full of plants. Like, as you know, you can do a low carb diet even with no animal products at all. There's a huge spectrum. As long as your carbohydrates are low enough, it's a low carb diet.
Or low glycemic, high carb diet, relatively.
Right.
Yeah.
So I did that diet for a long time, 12 years before I discovered the carnivore diet. And over that time, so my weight immediately normalized, and probably lots of other things changed in my life. But then over the course of those 12 years, I aged and I had 2 children. And every time I gave birth, every time I went through the process of having a child, I gained weight, which I didn't completely lose, even though I returned to a low carb diet after the pregnancy. I didn't stay low carb during the pregnancies, not because I was worried about the health of it, but because I had, well, for one thing, I have hyperemesis gravidarum in my family, so I had extreme nausea. It was just really important to eat whatever I could get down, and sometimes that was the highest carb thing I could think of.
Is that a condition I hadn't heard of that. Is that a condition that's associated with increased nausea during pregnancy?
Yeah, and to the point where people often have to be hospitalized to be rehydrated because it's not just nausea. A lot of people experience nausea in the first trimester and maybe even some morning sickness, vomiting. But my mother, for example, always lost weight through her pregnancies and had to be hospitalized because she just literally couldn't keep food down.
Wow.
Yeah. So I didn't have it nearly as bad as she did or as other women in my family have had. And I don't know why, if that's a genetic difference or because of things in my environment, but I still had a really hard time with food. Regardless, over the course of these years, my weight was increasing despite the fact that I was on a low carb diet. And it was really distressing to me because from the moment that I had found that book, I was so persuaded by the science behind the healthiness of it that I couldn't understand how I could possibly be gaining weight. And I felt more and more like there was a discordance between what I believed and what my body was showing me. And that was very uncomfortable. And I started to become really desperate in a way. Like I would research things online. I would get a hold of some idea like of some kind of deficiency or some kind of nutrient or some kind of infection or something. I'd say, oh, maybe I have that. And so I would buy like a bottle of creatine and use that before I worked out. Or I would, just, I spent so much money on so many different crazy interventions. It's really embarrassing. But so I was at that point of desperation when I first encountered what was being called the ZC or zero carb diet at the time. And some people still call it that. I tend to not use that word. All the words that I've come up with are also confusing, it turns out. But what they meant was not literally zero carb, because you wouldn't eat plant oils even though they have no carbs, and you would eat eggs or shellfish or liver even though they're not zero carbohydrates. But the idea was just animal foods and no plant foods. And I had discovered this forum called Zeroing In on Health, where some people who were a lot like me in background, it seemed, where they were on a low-carb diet and either it didn't get them to where they wanted to be, or they had some regain, and going on this all-animal food diet had solved that problem for them, along with a bunch of other things, which is why ultimately it was called Zeroing In on Health, and not zeroing in on weight, for example.
Right.
Because people were sharing these kind of bizarre stories about things that were improving for them that they didn't expect. So for me, though, it was all about vanity. I didn't consider myself to have any health problems, although I did have a really serious health problem. And that was that I had, at the same time that I gained all that weight in my freshman year, I was diagnosed with clinical depression for the first time. And that had continued through all this time. And had even been re-diagnosed as a form of bipolar disorder, type 2 bipolar disorder, which is different from type 1 in that you don't have psychotic breaks. So you would have the depression part, and you would have something leading up to mania called hypomania, just a small mania where there's excitability and a lot of the same characteristics, but it never goes to the same degree. So I had that new diagnosis, but I didn't consider that to be a health problem in the sense of something that diet could address, because, well, it's just was never talked about that way. To everything that I knew, a psychiatric problem was purely a genetic problem, purely something that you're unlucky about, and that has nothing to do with the environment. So that didn't even occur to me as something that a diet could solve. But what happened was, when I decided to try this all meat diet purely for vanity reasons, I was nearly 200 pounds. I might have actually been 200 pounds. I think I kind of didn't want to look at the scale anymore. I know it was over 195 at one point. So I tried this diet, and within a couple of weeks, not only was I losing weight rapidly and feeling really good, but my mood seemed to be stable in a qualitatively different way from just being good. Now, of course, if you've got bipolar disorder, your mood changes a lot, and you don't, at 2 weeks, you don't say, oh, my bipolar is cured. And of course, I didn't even go there, but I noticed it. And ultimately, the reason that I'm still on an all-animal food diet today is because after that experience, there was a diversion, because immediately after that, I started a zero carb diet. I got pregnant again, and I wasn't zero carb throughout the pregnancy. But as soon as the baby was born, I went back on this all meat diet, and I had to go off my psychiatric meds because I was pregnant. So because the safety was unknown, right? So I gave birth to the baby, went right back on this diet, and I never needed meds again. So that's my story.
That's fascinating. I mean, people like you and I who are deep in the weeds on nutrition and who do a lot of self-experimentation, we understand, I think, uniquely just how much your food choices can impact on your mental health. And it's incredible when you start looking at, I'm eating this way and I feel this way, I'm eating this way and I'm feeling this way. And there's actually a lot of studies out there For somebody who's listening, who's saying, well, I'm not saying it's like dispositive of every situation, but there are studies out there that do link vegetarian diets and vegan diets with mental health problems. And there's more than a few. And it's something that people go on these diets because there's a lot of marketing behind them. And for some people, there's tremendous health benefits behind them as well. But you never really get the caveats of like, okay, hey, if you're going on this diet, you might become very deficient in DHA. You might have this problem, this problem, and this problem. In fact, what happens instead is the commentators who are kind of, the thought leaders in those spaces, they tend to deny the existence of those types of issues, which basically takes people off the scent when they go on those diets that they could be having these kinds of problems. And you hear it over and over again. Some people, when they go on vegan and vegetarian diets, it exacerbates, mental health problems.
Yep.
We had on Chris Masterjohn a few episodes back, and he blames basically a cholesterol deficiency. I think it's like Smith-Lumley-Opitz, one of these genetic disorders he thinks that he may have that's associated with cholesterol deficiency, and that gave him all these mental health problems when he went on a vegan diet.
That's interesting.
Okay, so that sets the table. You're in this situation where this made a drastic improvement in your health and a drastic improvement in your mental health. What does a day on the carnivore diet look like for you right now? Like, are you doing 3 meals a day? Are you doing intermittent fasting? Where do you, I'm sure in Boulder, you can probably get nice quality beef and all that. So like, what does the logistics of it look like just on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've been doing this a long time, and it's definitely changed over the years. I sort of go into phases where I'll be really into this food or into that food. But the basic pattern is that I've settled out almost always at 2 meals a day. I usually don't eat breakfast. I feel that it's very important to pay attention to physiological signals of hunger. So if I'm hungry in the morning, I'm just going to eat breakfast. It's not really about trying to eat a certain way as far as that goes. But that's what naturally kind of came out for me. And I eat a combination. I eat a lot of different animal foods. I eat a lot of beef and lamb. Those are probably my favorite. But I also eat pork and chicken and eggs and seafood. I love oysters. I like organ meats. I don't get there isn't a lot of variety to be had in organ, even if you go out specifically looking for it, but I'll eat liver now and then. I love brain. It's one of my favorite organ meats.
Brain's almost very trendy right now. There's a lot of people that, I know there's like even desiccated brain supplements that are out there that people are like, this is going to ramp up your mental, your cognition. You got to have the brain. Okay. So you're doing nose to tail, basically.
Yeah. And again, it's not something that I'm really going out of my way to do. I'm not 100% persuaded that nose to tail is exactly how we developed eating meat. And we can get into that if you want at some point, like how humans started with scavenging and eating after the big carnivores. But it's mainly because I've always loved food and I like a variety of food. And so that's my main motivation for eating that way.
Since you went on the carnivore diet, have you done blood work? Are your biomarkers meshing with the benefits in mental health that you're seeing? Like, how do you see the whole lab work piece playing into the carnivore diet? That's one thing we're probably going to touch on here. I have some very nerdy things to get into on that front for us in a minute.
Well, this ties into how my food has changed as well, because I meant to say this when you originally asked it. What I ate when I first started a carnivore diet, where I was much more financially constrained than I am now. And so I ate only like regular conventional meat. And that in itself was sufficient to get me past my mental health problems. So I think that's really important to take note of, that you don't have to be perfectionist. But of course, the longer that I've been eating meat, the more I have appreciated the role of the meat industry, the care of the animals, the care of the earth. All those things have become more important to me. And because I have the ability, and because, like you said, I live in Colorado, where I'm surrounded by farms. Like I can probably, if I look out the right window, I can see cattle somewhere. So I do go to different farms to get good meat now. So likewise, before I started my carnivore diet, I was not in the habit of taking regular lab work at all. And there's one thing that I would suggest to anybody who's going to take on a new diet to try to find out something, get before labs, because you'll be kicking yourself.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I'd been doing the carnivore diet for 5 years before I got my first set of lab work. And I was really fortunate in that because at least what I got at that time, my doctor's office had a deal that no longer exists, in which I got a really comprehensive view of a lot of different things. So I have some lab work from that time when I was feeling really great. And then I've done some lab work, a lot more in the last couple years, and that was greatly influenced by my friend Siobhan Huggins, who works at the cholesterol code with Dave Feldman.
Yeah, we know Dave. I'm a big fan of Dave. I've studied his model and listened to a bunch of interviews that he's done. He is a fascinating dude and seems like a really cool guy too, by the way. Just seems like a very friendly, he's like kind of guy you'd want to have a beer with, you know?
Oh my gosh. I couldn't say enough good things about him from both a professional and a personal standpoint. He is total mensch. And Siobhan is as well. And because of their influence, I got more and more interested in taking more lab work, both for the purposes of troubleshooting things in my own life, for getting baselines, and what I felt was even more important maybe is to just start getting data collection from our community, because
absolutely,
because it's absolutely absent from all the data sets that we look at. So if you'll allow me to rant for just a second, we have all these huge studies that look at maybe diet or maybe not diet, but maybe biomarkers, and then correlate them with a bunch of different diseases. Imagine if you had a huge data set and you knew that 99% or 100% of the people on it were on a grain-based diet, and you looked at people who were showing ketones in their urine or in their blood. That's going to be always correlated with severe health problems, right? Like risk of heart attack and risk of diabetes. But that's because on a high carb diet, you should never be showing ketones. But then if you use that data set to say, oh, look at you, you've got ketones in your urine, something is terribly, terribly wrong, you can't do that because you just don't have the base of data. So part of my motivation to start collecting more data came from this realization that if we're going to be able to understand what actually correlates with risk, we have to start getting data now.
For sure. I think that's great. I know Dave and his team are mad scientists just doing all these, for the people that don't know, we'll link to Dave's website, but he documents everything that he eats. And then he has this very specific, he calls it the energy model, which is a model that explains why, that in his view, explains why people that are basically in a state of ketosis or on a low carb diet often see, and this group is called lean mass hyperresponder, who often see this huge uptick in cholesterol-rich LDL particle. Now, to be fair, our team here doesn't necessarily follow Dave's model or agree with it, but I will say that it's very cool that he has a model in the first place. I certainly don't have a model of lipids, so I tip my hat to him for the work. But let's talk a little bit about lipids. So,
sure.
Where do you come down on this whole thing? I mean, you have basically a lot of the people in the low carb camp are very skeptical that LDL plays a role in heart disease. Of course, I think we know that it's more complicated than just LDL. Then there's some people who are like, geez, man, you need to get your LDL, cholesterol, below 50 or you're going to drop dead, kind of a thing. So what's your sense of all this lipid wise?
Right. So it's kind of a perfect analogy to what I just said about finding ketones in somebody who's eating a high carb diet. Like, we would know that in that context, that would definitely indicate a problem. But because something like LDL has different mechanisms that could cause LDL to be, then you can't necessarily tell which of those mechanisms is responsible if you do see LDL. And so that's a danger of looking at one marker in context. So if you look at even the epidemiology that is all presumably based on high carbers, and you look at the LDL, it doesn't seem to be, it is definitely associated with heart disease if you look at it just as an isolated marker. But I think that's, I have some background in data science actually, and I think that if you look at that in isolation, you're being misled by the weight of the people who are not representative of what you're really interested in. If you look at only the cases where, and there's no intervention from drugs, but only the cases where triglycerides are low and HDL is high, in other words, where there is not a disorder of insulin resistance. As far as I can tell, that correlation between high LDL and heart disease and other problems goes away. And so I'm very skeptical for that reason that LDL could be a problem. Another reason is that going back to different mechanisms that can cause LDL to be high. There's an idea that heart disease, that LDL is actually causal in heart disease. So you see this association over and over again, and it's very tempting to believe that this is reinforcing a particular causality structure that may have been an assumption in the first place. So if you look at the different roles of LDL in the body, one thing it's not even controversial, it's just hardly ever talked about, is that LDL actually has a role in the immune system. It binds to pathogens. It takes on oxidation. And we know that what's even more correlated to heart disease than high LDL is high oxidized LDL. But the reason it's being oxidized is that's a sign that there's damage there, that the LDL is being used to mop up that oxidation. And so the hypothesis that I think is the most likely that would explain the correlation between high LDL and heart disease is that heart disease is endothelial damage. And the LDL is bringing cholesterol and bringing itself to the site to try to repair damage. And that damage is ongoing. And so what I'm seeing, the hypothesis or the school of thought that I would place my bets on is that the reason we see LDL there is because it's actually a mechanism of protection. And that if we blame the LDL, we're actually blaming, the firefighters.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a very eloquent, recitation of kind of the low carb position on LDL. There's a lot to get into in that statement. I think one of the interesting things is that you have this breach of basically the cells of the artery wall by a sterol. So the LDL delivers that sterol to the artery wall. And it's really the subsequent inflammation that causes heart disease in terms of the immune system reacting to something that's not supposed to be there.
Right.
So I hear you there. My thing is two things. One, I've never understood how you can, through diet, control for some oxidation in LDL particle, number one. Number two, I don't understand in Dave's energy model how the cholesterol remnant, his model is basically you're insulin sensitive, your triglycerides are low, but your VLDL particle is spinning so much triglyceride for energy that at the end stage of that, because when a VLDL particle basically drops off its triglyceride load, at the end of that process, it morphs into an intermediate density lipoprotein, and then it becomes an LDL particle, like an LDL ApoB carrying LDL particle.
Right.
And it maintains some of its cholesterol. Its predominant payload is triglycerides, but it maintains some of its cholesterol.
Right.
So that LDL that's morphed from a VLDL particle now into a cholesterol carrying LDL particle is, in Dave's model, responsible for the increasing cholesterol that you see in the low mass hyperresponders. But the problem is that if you look at the science, as the patient becomes more the triglycerides go lower and an individual becomes more insulin sensitive, their VLDL production actually goes way down. And so I don't understand how you can have remnant cholesterol be responsible for massive upticks in LDL cholesterol in these hyperresponders because of the fact that it doesn't respect mass balance. And I listened to Dave's interview with Peter Attia, which I would recommend to our audience probably 8 times. And I just couldn't resolve for myself the answer to this simple question, which is, where's the extra cholesterol coming from in these lean mass hyperresponders? Now, that's a very technical point. We're not going to see eye to eye on that point, and that's fine. But the question then becomes, where are you comfortable having an LDL particle count or an LDL cholesterol number sitting? Because of the fact, and I ask it just to bring it back to a real life example, Mikhaila Peterson.
Right.
So Mikhaila Peterson, and this is where I'm so excited to just get very nerdy and talk about Sitosterolemia because nobody wants to talk about it with me, and I know you're going to be you're going to be willing to chat about it for a little bit, so it's going to be a nice thing to just be able. But Mikhaila Peterson, for the audience that doesn't know, she's a famous carnivore dieter. She has a very similar situation to yours. She's obviously healthier on a carnivore diet. Her father's obviously healthier on a carnivore diet, and then she published her blood work, and her LDL particles at like in the 600s, which is, I mean, that's much better than my LDL particle, right? And I'm being very cautious. I'm being very cautious about what I'm eating. You know, I'm somebody who's more of a lean mass hyperresponder. Like, I'm lucky if I can get my LDL particle into the 900s. She's on a carnivore diet and her LDL particles in the 600s. Problem is, the people that are in her camp ideologically would almost have to concede based on that number that she's at an increased risk because she has low LDL particle. Because as we know, LDL particle has this crucial role in the immune system, and it's so good for you, and you want to have it at 1,500, 1,600, 2,000. So is Mikhaila Peterson somebody who's thriving on a carnivore diet or who is immunosuppressed because she's on the carnivore diet?
Right. So there's a whole lot there that I want to respond to, but let me first just say, I'm not pretending I know the answer to this. Like, we have these different hypotheses, and I think the best thing that we can do right now is figure out how to test the hypotheses, because we don't know. We just don't know. I wanted to say something about the VLDL production going down when you're on a high-fat diet. That's true, and it's not.
When you're insulin sensitive. I know Dave.
When you're insulin sensitive. Right.
Right. I know Dave would say that if you're in ketosis, you're spinning out so much VLDL particle. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that he did in his work that was really eye-opening to me is to show the difference between. So we're already talking about a low-carb baseline background, but the difference in LDL, which, as we talked about, is kind of a marker of there having been VLDL. It goes way down if you eat a whole lot of fat compared to if you fast, right? At those ends of the spectrum. So I think that that's really really part of the crux of his whole theory. And I definitely don't understand it as well as he does, and he'll certainly correct me if he listens to this and I say something wrong. But I think part of the essence of that idea is that when you're very athletic, so you're the lean mass hyper-responder kind of quintessential stereotypical type, what that means is you're doing a lot of exercise and you're really making use of your fat stores as the source, just like in fasting. Whereas if you're a high-carb dieter who is either sedentary or who eats a lot of fat, your LDL will actually go down relative to that phenotype. And in fact, if you look at the data from Paleomedicina, which is a clinic in Hungary where they treat patients with a plant-free diet that is actually highly ketogenic. So it's a limited protein, very high-fat version of a carnivore diet. They actually see what they call normalized LDL readings in their patients. They say that this very high LDL is actually something that they don't see in their patients and becomes normalized when they have patients who go from the regular carnivore diet to the very high fat version. So maybe that's too much of a diversion.
No, I don't think, no, it's not. Your point's well taken. I mean, look, this is, the more I research, the more I realize just how much I don't know. And lipids is a terribly, terribly complex topic. I think you're right on. I mean, it's, I don't think we're resolving the issue here, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have in light of the popularity of the carnivore diet. And I feel like it's my job for the people that listen to say that our view is that you probably don't want to be walking around with an LDL particle count that's heightened, even if you are on a low carb, high fat diet and feeling great, because of the fact that, again, in our view, not your view, we respect your view, we respect Dave's view. In our view, you're at an increased risk for heart disease. And if the particle count gets high enough, you're probably at an increased risk for death in that condition, walking around in that condition, especially if there's other biomarkers that are present.
Right.
And, because at the end of the day, it's just about cluing people in and saying, hey, believe me, don't believe me, call me an idiot. Go ahead, fine. You just have to decide who you're gonna have to decide who you believe, and then you're just gonna have to just roll with it, And so it's just another little piece of the puzzle in a much broader conversation.
Absolutely. So when I had those labs done in 2013, after 5 years on a carnivore diet, and I feel like one of the healthiest times in my life, actually, my LDL-P was over 2,000.
Okay.
Right now, the latest reading that I've had in the last few months, I think it was around 1,400.
Okay.
So that may have been a peak for me. But yeah, I'm definitely walking around with a high LDL-P, and I don't know if that's increasing my risk of heart disease. As we've already discussed, my hypothesis is that I'm not, but I could totally be wrong. And anyone who wants to try a diet that is going to put their LDL-P high has to make a decision for themselves. Either they don't believe that it's a risk, or they believe it's a risk and it's worth the trade-off, or don't do it,
Right, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, yeah. Well, in your case, I mean, look, you're somebody who, one of the things that I was so excited to have you on the show is it's obvious following you, watching the interviews that you do, you take a very measured position, you do a ton of research, you're obviously very knowledgeable, and you're somebody who said, hey, look, I need to make this intervention so that I can feel good and I can feel happy, and 100% respect that. LDL particle of 1,400, it's not even that high. I don't know percentile wise, like where that sits, but that's not like an off the charts high LDL particle. But speaking of that, so I mean, Mikhaila Peterson is somebody who is, one of the poster children for, and I know she spoke at your conference.
Yeah.
What do you think? So one of the things that, because there's that show Diagnosis, where I believe it's like you basically have these strange conditions, and then people just kind of throw their ideas into the hat and guess at, and then hopefully like in an educated way, what the issue could be. And when I heard about that, having done a bunch of research on like the ABCG8 and ABCG5 genes, which are basically just like how you're absorbing plant-sterol,
yeah,
I thought, man, I wonder if like Mikhaila Peterson and the Bell brothers, who've complained about these joint issues, have this rare genetic condition called Sitosterolemia,
right,
which is characterized by absorbing because usually you'll eat avocado, there's sterol in the avocado plant fat, you temporarily absorb it, and then your gut kicks it back out.
Right.
But in people that have this mutation, they just mainline it. They'll just keep absorbing it, in perpetuity, and they get these xanthomas, which are these fatty deposits in their joints, and it messes up their tendons. And there's a lot of history of joint problems, which is exactly what Mikhaila Peterson had.
Right.
Have you seen anything around like sterol absorption? Has that been on your research radar at all?
Not really. So I have a few things to say about that idea. One is it's a really neat idea, and it could be part of the answer for why a carnivore diet is so helpful in these specific cases. Like, definitely Mikhaila seems to fit that picture. A lot of people have joint problems that get resolved through a carnivore diet. My hypothesis heretofore about why a carnivore diet would help with joint problems is from a kind of more general relief of autoimmune-like conditions tied into intestinal permeability. But it could be a combination. I personally have never had joint issues and definitely never any xanthomas. I did get, I mentioned that my first blood work was very comprehensive. It didn't have everything that I wish that it had, but I did get some sterol markers.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I'll tell you the numbers. I don't know if it would mean anything to you off the top of your head, but I have 4 markers here. Sterol was at 3.29.
Okay.
Sitosterol at 1.71, and those are both marked as in the optimal range, not the hypo range. And then I have, I'm not sure if it's pronounced cholestanol or cholestanol. That's marked high at 7.21. Yeah, I guess the others are just ratios. So in the context here, I had been on a carnivore diet for 5 years, but I was drinking coffee. And I've been drinking coffee most of the time on this diet. So I don't know, like, where do those even come from if you're on a carnivore diet? The only thing I can think of is that they came from coffee. And I don't know, this is another place where I wish I had the before picture, but that's what I've got. So if that's interesting to you, I can send you those if you haven't written them down or you have more questions about it.
I think it's interesting. I have the same reaction as you do. Is like, where would you get the Sitosterol?
Yeah.
Because for the people listening at home, I think there's some controversy in the field as to whether some of the sterol markers are used as proxies for how much cholesterol you're synthesizing. And then some of the sterol markers are basically for how much cholesterol you're absorbing, but also how much plant-sterol you're absorbing. So that's really interesting that you would have you think they'd be like in the basement floor.
Right.
That's beyond my knowledge on that one.
Right. And that's something maybe we can get more information about later if we try some targeted experiments. Are these levels as high as they are because I have Sitosterolemia, and if I had any more, they'd be through the roof, and this is like they're low because because that's as low as they get with coffee. I don't even know. I think what's really important here, what's really cool, is you've got this idea, and now we can try to come up with some way to test the hypothesis and figure out who it's affecting and how we would know.
Maybe we can try to do something at the next Carnivore Conference, like bring some, because we have some of the ABC G8 and ABC G5. We have a sterol absorption report on our custom nutrition plan reports that gives you a window into some of your status for how you might be. Of course, at the end of the day, you have to get your labs done, but you can diagnose Sitosterolemia with just a genetic test. There's some researchers around the country that are doing work on that. And then just another interesting little thing for listeners at home. I found a researcher in Utah who believes that if you have LDL cholesterol above 190, now I think you could probably exclude the lean mass hyperresponders because that's either coming from cholesterol remnant or it's coming from greater synthesis of cholesterol or both. But he thinks that if you're eating what would presumably be a diet that included some plants and sterol, that if you have an LDL cholesterol of over 190, then you have a prima facie case for Sitosterolemia, which is super interesting. Because one of the things people don't realize is that in your LDL cholesterol number, when you look at the mass of cholesterol, like in your particles, it's not just cholesterol, it's also sterol.
Interesting.
So you're seeing like Mikhaila Peterson, like Aaron and I, who's the geneticist and head of research at Gene Food, like prior to this show, we were doing some chatting, and he's not as in love with the Sitosterolemia theory as I am, to be candid, but because he thinks it's very speculative. But you just wonder, what if Mikhaila Peterson had really great ability to clear LDL particle, like some kind of special, maybe PCSK9 variant that was very favorable for metabolizing fat. And then she had tons of absorption on the flip side of sterol. So I wonder what her LDL, particle and cholesterol would look like if she was eating a bunch of avocado. That would be interesting. I mean, she's never going to do it, obviously, but we could get some of those people tested for sterol absorption. Right.
So I guess there's kind of two scenarios. One is Sitosterolemia is really rare, and if you find out you have it, then you're a good candidate for a carnivore diet. And the other situation is oh, it's more graduated or more common or both than we thought it was. And so maybe there are more people who could benefit.
Yeah, there is a case to be made. And, plant-based people and vegans who are listening are like literally like punching their steering wheel and freaking out. But there is actually a case to be made. The problem is, like you said so well, it's like, you're lucky you have these labs. You had a friend in Dave and his team that could get you these labs. Most people don't have access to these labs. Nobody's getting their sterile panels done because those sterile panels on the Sitosterol side, again, proxy marker for cholesterol absorption, maybe not even that reliable, but what it does straight up tell you is it tells you that you have this plant-sterol in your blood. And if you have a lot of it in your blood, there's a good New England Journal of Medicine study that shows that basically oxidized plant-sterols bind preferentially to LP(a), which is a particularly dangerous form of LDL particle. So it's like, yeah, this is stuff that, and in that case, avocado and nuts and seeds and all the plant fats are not really that good for you.
Right.
They're not. You would be better off eating more meat, and you probably would be, better on a diet that was more carnivore.
Right.
Let's get into some of these other issues because you've done a ton of research on, for example, gut health. I know there's a lot we can learn from you on butyrate production. Tell us, because a lot of people are thinking, well, where are you getting your fiber from? I know that's a big one for you, and so tell us your research there.
Sure. So fiber is a funny one because, again, we have this whole epidemiological base that says if you've got more fiber in your diet, it looks like you might be better off. But there are so many reasons why that might be true. What my favorite explanation actually is that fiber is itself a marker of lack of processing or refinement of carbohydrates. And so my favorite theory about why the epidemiology might show a preference for higher fiber diets is that it's not so much the fiber itself that's actually creating the benefit. It's not refining your carbohydrates, and the fiber would be a marker for that. Of course, we also have evidence from other societies. If you look at, just historically, the Inuit obviously didn't have a very high fiber diet. The Plains Mongolians didn't have a very high fiber diet. It's definitely not a deal breaker for health. and then you could also look at carnivores, like real carnivores, the other mammals that eat only meat. They have colons. Felines have colons. It's definitely not the case that they're suffering from their lack of fiber. So I think that kind of information is at least enough to make you pause and think, wait a minute, where's this assumption coming from? But most of the benefit, if you look at the research that is used to advocate for a high fiber diet comes from the short chain fatty acids that are produced by the microbes in your gut. And people talk about, especially butyrate, how important those short chain fatty acids are. I would argue that, first of all, you don't need plant fiber to get butyrate because your microbes are very much adapt to what the environment you give them is. And so there are many kinds of microbes that can produce butyrate that don't do it from plant fiber. They do it from amino acids or from, I'm losing the word, collagen-like materials that are in animals, for example, or even Akkermansia, which goes higher in people who are on a fasting or a ketogenic diet, is a butyrate. It's actually a butyrate producing microbe that then can give that butyrate to the gut. There are many, I've written about this and I'm trying to remember exactly all the pieces, but if you look at, for example, Crohn's or IBD related diseases, there was this hypothesis that butyrate and fiber specifically would help with that. But what you actually find is that once you get to the point where you have that kind of problem in your colon, your colon's not absorbing the butyrate. That's the real problem. So adding more fiber at that point tends to be more of a hindrance than a help. And then the other part of the picture that I find really fascinating is that a lot of the benefit that comes from that butyrate seems to come from the metabolites of butyrate once your colon has absorbed it. And guess what that metabolite is? It's beta-hydroxybutyrate.
I saw your some of the stuff you wrote about that. It's really interesting.
So I don't think we know all the answers, but I think there's enough questions that I would need to see a lot more evidence to show that fiber was actually necessary in the way that mainstream health suggests that it is.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that what you're seeing with people that eat a ton of fiber is that they're not eating a lot of refined grains, pancakes, pretzels, etc.
Right.
And I also understood as I was reading some of your stuff before the podcast, that you're basically saying that in a state of ketosis, we're going to have adequate butyrate. Is that accurate, or is that expressing the theory properly?
Well, not exactly. And
Okay.
and there is a bit of a disconnect. So you've got the side where the butyrate's coming in. You can't really get ketones there. You can get ketones on the other side, like on the bloodstream side. So what I was suggesting in that article is that maybe the benefits that we're seeing that are associated with butyrate have to do with the beta-hydroxybutyrate that it is immediately metabolized into as soon as it gets across the cell wall. And so for example, part of the mechanism that we think is important with butyrate is that it's an HDAC inhibitor, but so is beta-hydroxybutyrate. So
Okay.
if you drill down into where the mechanism of benefit is, it seems like in many cases, at least, the beta-hydroxybutyrate, the end result of that butyrate, is actually where the benefit's coming from, and we know how to raise beta-hydroxybutyrate.
Ketones.
Right.
Or being in a state of ketosis.
Right.
Okay, that's a cool theory. Now, let me hit you with this. This is something that we traded the emails about prior to the show, and this kind of jives nicely with so we came up with this individual that we think would do better on a more carnivore style diet, which is somebody that has high sterol absorption or somebody that even has Sitosterolemia. So Aaron and I came up with an individual, again, not a theory, just like, let's say this person is walking around. So they have low stomach acid, low hydrochloric acid levels in the stomach. And we've done some blogs on this. Like when you actually dust off the blood type diet, one of the interesting things that you notice is that although that diet doesn't have a lot of, evidence behind it, your levels of hydrochloric acid tend to correlate with your blood type. So somebody who has type O blood is more likely to have more hydrochloric acid than somebody who has type A plus, who's likely to have the least. So let's say there's somebody that has type A plus blood type and they do indeed have low levels of hydrochloric acid. They take an HCl supplement. They don't feel any burning. That's one of the tests that some functional docs say you can do. So they have that. They have low levels of an enzyme called diamine oxidase, which clears histamine.
Mm-hmm.
So they're more prone to histamine issues. And then this is the big one that I wanted for people listening. One of the interesting things about nutrigenomics is that you find these different levels of enzyme activity based on people's genetic variability. So there's a process called the urea cycle, which is responsible for removing all of the waste from animal protein, the nitrogen molecules in animal protein. It's turned into ammonia in the liver, and then it's turned into urea in the kidney, and then you basically pee it out. Well, there are children that are born with zero urea cycle function, meaning they cannot metabolize any protein. So the minute that they have any protein at the beginning of their lives, they get very sick. And there are some theories of nutrigenomics out there. There's markers like CPS1 that tend to indicate that we as a population have wide disparities in how much urea cycle function we have. So you, Amber, you might be able to effectively break down these waste products of protein metabolism very well. Me, John, I might not do as good of a job. So I might start to have an ammonia buildup. You have Amy Yasko's theory about basically ammonia neutralizing BH4, which is a nitric oxide precursor. So you have that person. So they're eating the animal flesh. They're not digesting it. It's getting into the colon intact. And it just as the fiber does, which is one mechanism for producing butyrate, it ferments. And it starts to give off putrescine, and it starts to irritate the lining of the colon, and it starts to produce histamine. And that is something that has been theorized to be very deleterious to colon health. And that's a person who's walking around in a state of pain and anxiety after having gone on the carnivore diet, right? So that's the message that we wanted to bring to this conversation, because there's so much marketing that's going on. And, on the vegan side too, look, there's all these propaganda films, but it's happening now on carnivore. And people are just out there like, all plants are bad for you, never eat them. And what about this person who shouldn't be on the carnivore diet? And if you have anything to say about urea cycle, any of that, that's great as well.
Yeah. Okay. So many things there. First of all,
I hit you with that's a long, very long list. I'm sorry. We can take it one at a time.
That's okay. I took a couple of notes while you were talking, so maybe I'll be able to hit everything.
Okay.
So first of all, definitely if someone's got some kind of inborn error of metabolism, you all bets are off for like what everybody else should do for a healthy diet, right? You have to address it. If you're a phenylketone uric, you can't have phenylalanine, and that's just end of story, right? So definitely for people who have rare metabolic issues, you've got to address that. You've got to do what you've got to do. Low hydrochloric acid is an interesting one. I don't know that much about it. I know a little bit about it. What I think I've understood from the literature is that it's actually pretty adaptable, and that you can get into a cycle where your hydrochloric acid is low, and that makes it hard for you to absorb the nutrients to make more hydrochloric acid, and you can get into a bad feedback loop with that. So there's some possibility that if you're starting out with low hydrochloric acid, you may be able to improve that. I know nothing about the connection between blood types and hydrochloric acid at all, so I can't really comment on that.
We'll put in the show notes. We have an infographic that we did on it.
Okay, cool. The urea cycle thing, I want to just distinguish two things about function. If you do a measurement of creatine in your urine, that can be a flag for poor kidney function, right? Mm-hmm. But it can also just be a marker of high protein intake. So it's really important to understand the context. If you see measurements that would indicate to you if you were an average person with average protein intake, that would definitely be a marker of poor function. But if we knew about you that you were eating high protein, then that worry goes away, because that's not the etiology of that marker. So I don't know what you're...
Do you mean creatinine or creatine?
Oh, I'm sorry, creatinine, yes.
Okay.
Beyond that, though, I also want to emphasize that you can do a carnivore diet at a high protein level or at a low protein level. It all depends on how much fat you're eating, right? So I mentioned Paleomedicina already. They are at the very high fat end of the spectrum of recommendation. They think that high protein is actually, and when they say high, I think they would recommend that a person have no more than, okay, I'm going to have to draw a figure out of the air, but maybe somewhere between 80 and 100 grams of protein a day. Whereas someone on a carnivore diet, the way that a lot of people practice it here in the US, it might be more like 200 or 250 grams of protein a day. So that's a huge range of different kinds of ways of doing a carnivore diet. So you're talking about this hypothetical person who has a hard time dealing with protein for various reasons. You can definitely, if they need to, I mean, we've got a lot of different things to balance here, but if this person decides that for some reason they would be better off without plants, they can still design a carnivore diet that would not be stressing their ability to use protein. That's all I wanted to say about that part.
A low protein, a very more ketogenic style carnivore diet.
Right. Now it wouldn't be super low protein, but I guess you know, the difference between 20% protein and 35% protein could be a lot for a certain individual.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. On the urea cycle thing, that's very exploratory. It's just something that, it's a genetic explanation for why one person might thrive on a very high protein diet and why somebody else might not. And it's out there. Harvard's written some stuff about this, and there are studies that are out there about some of these genes and how they can impact on blood pressure and things like that. So we've kind of talked about this whole butyrate, beta-hydroxybutyrate issue. We've talked about high fat, lower protein carnivore diets. How important do you think it is when you're on the carnivore diet to be testing to confirm that you are in ketosis, if at all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think ketosis itself is more important for some people than other people. I mean, definitely if you're epileptic, you're going to want to keep those ketones high, and you're not going to do any chance taking. I would say that most people who go on a carnivore diet and eat ad libitum come to approximately something like 70% fat by calorie, and that's usually mildly ketogenic. It's not super ketogenic, but I think it's over the point where Finney, for example, used to say that therapeutic benefits of ketosis start at around 0.5 millimoles. Last year, I heard him say that he thinks that based on what they're seeing now, he thinks it might be as low as 0.4. And, this is just an arbitrary made up number. But the point is that it's not necessarily true that the higher the ketones, the better. One thing that I've noticed in the carnivore community is that the people who seem to be getting the most benefit don't see a correlation between ketosis and low ketosis and high ketosis. And so for them, I think most of the benefit has something to do with removing something that for them is causing ongoing damage, which requires inflammation in order to heal it. On the other hand, I'm fascinated with ketosis. I have been for a very long time, just because of its amazing effects on the brain. And I think even someone who's on a carnivore diet could probably experience extra benefit from being in ketosis sometimes, even if they don't need to be in ketosis all the time to get the lion's share of the of the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to kind of decouple these ideas. The ketosis, I think most people are going to be in mild ketosis on carnivore. Oh, and that kind of brings up another whole area, whole can of worms, and that's I guess the difference between fasting and a carnivore diet, and the whole idea of timing and protein. The connection between all of those is how deep in ketosis can you get? How much autophagy can you get if you're eating high levels of protein? This question comes up a lot. And I think that one of the main ways to answer that has to do with how close you are to ketosis on your default diet and how long you go between meals. So if you look at all of the literature on the benefits of fasting or intermittent fasting, almost all of it is done in this high carb context. So in order to get to this space where you're getting autophagy and cellular renewal and all of these benefits that you would get from fasting, you have to stop eating for like 3 whole days before that really starts to come into effect.
Mm-hmm.
So some people say, well, if you're on a carnivore diet, you're eating so much protein that you're negating the benefits that you would otherwise have gotten. But if you think about the fact that your diet is mildly ketogenic, say,
Mm-hmm.
and you eat a big meal maybe at 5 p.m., and then you don't eat again until the next day, I would postulate, because you don't have any of that glycogen, all of this postprandial kind of many-day process that you would have to go through from the point of a high carb diet down into to the sort of maximal ketogenesis where you're starting to get these benefits, I would postulate that even on a high protein, low carb diet, you're going to be getting intermittently overnight the same kinds of benefits that people on a high carb diet would have to go for, several days of fasting a month to make up for.
Interesting. Yeah. So for people playing along at home who might not have recognized that term autophagy, it's basically this idea that you have like your unhealthy immune cells will die off and they'll be replaced by healthy cells, and you'll have a regeneration of stem cells when you go on I think it was like Walter Longo. It takes days to do that. And what I hear you saying is because of the fact that you don't have to go through the period where you get rid of all the glucose that's in your system, all the kind of the sugar fuel, your theory is that you would be able to get into a state of autophagy faster in like a fat adapted state than you would in somebody who eats carbs.
Right. And the mTOR and the autophagy thing is something where I think to your purpose at the beginning of the show where there's this crosstalk between low carb and veganism, there's a sense in which we're blind men looking at feeling the elephant parts, right? Because mTOR can be inhibited by reducing glucose all by itself. And mTOR can be inhibited by reducing essential proteins all by itself. And so I actually think that one of the benefits of going on a whole food plant-based diet can actually be this increased, I guess what it really is happening is that AMPK is being upregulated in order to get some of those essential proteins out of your muscle tissue. But that whole process is the same pathway that leads to autophagy. And so I think this is one of the explanations why we can see some of the exact same benefits from a low carb diet and from a vegan diet on the other hand.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make. I think it's a good one. I mean, as a layperson, when I read the research of people that have done research on mTOR, which is known as like the cancer like growth pathway in the body, and even Walter Longo's research, who's the head of longevity at USC, some of our listeners may have heard us mention him before. He has a theory that basically certain amino acids are pro-inflammatory because they increase insulin-like growth factor, and then that turns on the cancer pathways. And that's his case against eating a diet that's high in protein. But at the same time, Amber's point is well taken, which is that spikes in insulin tend to do the same thing. To zoom out from a less kind of biochemical focused perspective, the way I always read that research what I hear the researchers saying is they say spikes in insulin will do this, and these amino acids in protein will do this, like methionine and leucine and the branched chain amino acids. They'll both do it, but you know what? We think that the protein amino acids probably do it a bit more, and so we're gonna side in our view on protein rather than carb restriction. And we're basically just gonna say manage your insulin spikes by not having super high glycemic carbs, but then keep the real bad guys are the inflammatory amino acids found in these proteins. Is that a conspiracy theory on behalf of plant-based movement to destroy and dominate the world? It could be. I don't know. That's just how I've always read that. But I think that's a great point.
It's really funny because I think you're exactly right. I think the plant-based people say, oh, it's the protein, and the keto people say, no, it's the glucose.
Yeah.
And they're actually both right, but they're both right in this beautiful way in that it's not that you need to reduce both, you need to reduce one or the other. Either one actually works.
Huh. Okay. Interesting. So pick your side and go with it.
Yeah, but then you've got consequences to deal with on either side. So obviously, I don't think personally that a vegan diet is sustainable in the same way that a carnivore diet, that I think a carnivore diet is. And one of the reasons is that the way that a plant-based diet, there's a paper in 1999, McCarty, I think, showing that the way that protein deprivation in vegans can have this positive effect is through upregulating glucagon. But the problem is if you need to have the anabolic phases. You can't just never grow. You can't just continue to deplete your protein resources. So that's why I think that long-term veganism can have an issue that long-term carnivore wouldn't have. Long-term carnivore might well have other issues, and we just don't know them yet.
Yeah.
But that's the lens through which I'm viewing it.
Well, you mentioned that word anabolic because, I mean, that's part of the reason why some of the kind of the more like CrossFit kind of bro community loves carnivore, because you know what a carnivore will do for you? It'll put muscle on you. That's what it'll do. I mean, it definitely will. If you start eating a bunch of chicken and steak, I mean, you just like that's a definite. So I mean, that's one bonus. Like you said, is that a trade-off? I don't know. I feel like another part of these conversations is nobody wants to acknowledge their trade-offs.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like everybody's diet has to be perfect, and anybody that brings up they're like, well, this could be a trade-off. It's like, no, that's not a trade-off. That's just junk science. That's a terrible study. That's epidemiology, or you know, that was funded by X and Y study. It's just we're throwing that out. Just go away with that.
There are trade-offs, and there are personal trade-offs that have nothing to do with wellness, actually. Like, if I really value being able to eat some kind of traditional food, or going and visiting some country and eating what they eat, or having a cake on my birthday, you know what? That's my decision. Like,
yeah.
It doesn't make my diet worse. Like, it's just a choice that you personally get to make.
For sure.
I'm really pro-choice.
I agree. It's a very kind of, you know, I have in my notes, there's basically two topics I want to close on. One of them I want to get to at the end is gout, because I think it's just an interesting, and you've talked about uric acid and all that. I definitely want to get into that. Just to riff on that though, your point you just made. I mean, it's this issue of freedom. I feel like a lot of the really hardcore carnivore stuff that's out there on YouTube, I don't know if you've dipped your toe in that water. It's some crazy water. It is some stormy seas. Like carnivore YouTube is crazy. Vegan YouTube is crazy. But I feel like I feel like it's sort of a backlash against what people perceive as being, you know, it's almost like Second Amendment carnivory, right? Like you're not taking our meat away from us. We're going to eat our meat. Like, don't you even think about it. And not only are you going to think about it, but I'm going to kick your ass on the science too. And I'm going to dig up, you know, 15 studies that contradict your sort of like agenda, and boom, like take that, nutritionfacts.org, like, and see how that tastes. You know, I feel like that's part of the deal here.
Yeah, I haven't actually spent a lot of time in either of those.
Good. Don't
communities.
Don't start. Don't
okay, thank you.
It's not a good idea. Yeah, you're not going to like what you see.
That I don't need to.
But then the last thing I'll say on that is just I do have concern for, because you're in Boulder. You know, Boulder is like the mecca of all these different health. And I mean, if you can walk out your front door and I'm sure find like amazing acupuncturists and farmers markets. My buddy and I were in Telluride a few weeks back. Like Colorado is such a amazing place for wellness and such an awesome state. People that go on to these diets though, like you said, the expense of it, it's going to by definition have to support factory farming. And I think even the people that are very pro ability to eat meat and pro regenerative farming using animal agriculture have to admit that there are externalities that are not accounted for with the way that these animals are raised. And they're raised in incredibly brutal, awful, terrible ways. And not only that, they're being given antibiotics at such a rate that that's probably the place where some kind of superbug would originate, would actually be from raising pork or raising beef. So how do you square that whole environmental piece with this lifestyle?
I definitely think that there are problems with factory farming and that we need to address them. No question. I do think that animal livestock is a really important part of the global ecology, and that we shouldn't try to throw that out. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but there are a lot of, I think there's a lot of work that can be done to make farming more sustainable. But I also think that if you're in a position where your health depends on meat and you've got limited resources, you have to put your own mask on first. Because, you know, if I think back to the kind of mental state that I was in before I found carnivore, I was dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no way I could have made a positive impact on the world.
Yeah.
It was hard enough for me to just live my day-to-day life. Whereas now I feel like I'm in a position where I can help solve, I mean, in my own small way, whatever I'm going to do, help make the world a better place. But until there's a bit of a bootstrapping thing where you have to get your nutritional elements in place however you're going to get them before you worry about, like, just iteratively, one step at a time, make it better.
No, you have to take care of yourself before you can care for others. I think that's a really thoughtful point there for sure. It's almost like we're kind of advancing towards maybe a day when you used to have your medical marijuana card. Maybe now you're going to have like your carnivore diet card. Like you have a you have the reasoning behind why you're eating this diet, and it's kind of like you're going to get more of your meat ration once all the meat gets taken away, and we're all eating, tofu and the Impossible Burger for the ball game. Okay, so last thing we're going to touch on is uric acid. When I first started digging into this, I was like, you know what? It's very simple. Uric acid is, putting my smart hat on. I'm like, well, uric acid is a metabolite of purine, and purine is in purine-rich foods. And if you eat a ton of purine-rich foods, you're going to have high uric acid, and that's going to lead to gout, and that's going to be terrible. And then once I did more research, I realized actually the body makes 2/3 of its own purine. And Aaron dug up these genetic markers where, if you have one of them, you have like a 32 times increased risk for developing gout, and another marker where it's based on uric acid reabsorption. Another one you had, like, it's a haplotype, like 3 genes, 92 times increased risk for gout. And then the last thing before I pass the mic is on Carnivore YouTube. He vacillates back and forth. This guy's channel is called The Vegetable Police, and he's hilarious. He basically does all these diets. He's been trying to heal colitis, and he went on the carnivore diet for 9 months, and he got gout, and he had to be on crutches and the whole nine, right? So you've lectured on this at conferences. What's your take on the whole meat to gout to uric acid issue?
This is one of my favorite topics, in part because I did just give a presentation on it at AHS in San Diego. So it's a little fresh in my mind, but I didn't talk a lot about gout, but gout is one of the first things you think of with uric acid because it's associated with high uric acid. But the truth is that high uric acid itself does not prove that you're going to get gout. Most people with high uric acid don't have gout. And people with gout, there's a large minority of people with gout who don't have high uric acid. So there's definitely more to the picture than how high uric acid is. In fact, lowering uric acid can predispose people to getting gout. And I think that unless I just haven't found the right pocket of research, I think we don't know a lot about what causes the uric acid to crystallize into the joint, which is what gout actually is. So if you could just have high uric acid and be humming along fine, but once a crystal forms, then it attracts more crystals to it, and then it deposits in your joint, and then that's absolutely, I'm told, excruciating. It's been compared to childbirth. In fact, it's been compared as worse than childbirth by some people.
For the kidney stone or for the
No, for gout.
Okay.
For gout.
Wow. Got
so there are some unknowns about that. Like you said, the amount from dietarily from eating purines is only contributes a small amount. It can definitely contribute. One thing. So humans, one of the reasons I got really interested in uric acid is that humans, in large part because we're primates, we have high uric acid because we don't, on the one side of it, we don't have uricase. None of the great apes, that is, have uricase. So we don't break down uric acid into allantoin to get rid of it. And so that puts us at higher risk. And there are all these theories about what was the advantage to not breaking that down. And there are all kinds of theories. One is that it's kind of an intellectual stimulant. It's related to caffeine. And there's some evidence that it could be contributing to a certain kind of use of intelligence in that way. Another is that it's very connected with our vitamin C. So another thing that primates don't have that most mammals do is the ability to generate their own vitamin C in their bodies. And it turns out that animals that don't have uricase have really high proportions of uric acid compared to vitamin C, and there seems to be this reciprocity of function that's happened. And uric acid potentiates vitamin C, so it makes a small amount go a longer way. But there's one other species or set of species that is similar in that way, and that's birds don't have uricase, and some birds don't have vitamin C synthesis either. But even the ones who do, so if you look at carnivorous birds, they have high uric acid, like all birds do. I looked at one study, they were looking at peregrine falcons, and their baseline measurement for a couple of falcons that they were looking at was similar to very high-end uric acid for a human, around 6.5. And that bird ate a meat meal, a typical meal for them, and their uric acid shot up 3 times the level to like something like 24. And there's, of course, no gout. Presumably they do this over and over again. So that's another example of high uric acid not necessarily being a problem.
I see. Okay.
The focus of my talk was to think about uric acid gets a bad rap because it's associated again with metabolic syndrome. And in the context of that dysfunctional insulin sensitivity, it may actually be exacerbating things. But there are three ways that we can raise our uric acid. One is from eating it. One is from tissue damage, because tissue damage, like if you're going through chemo, your uric acid might skyrocket into dangerous levels, because basically you're eating the same purines, except they're from your own tissue or from the tumor tissue.
Or your endogenous, the purines you make are going up, basically. Or they're being spun off by some cell repair or something, or.
So it's like you're eating your own tissue and you're eating the tumor tissue because it breaks down, but it goes immediately into your bloodstream. So it's kind of the same as if you had eaten some organ meat, but you're eating it from the inside. It's not a normal thing, but tissue damage can do that.
Okay.
Then you've got heightened uric acid just from upregulated gluconeogenesis. And I think that this is what explains, there's been at least some study of different diets and what their uric acid was like. And you might have expected that meat eaters, not carnivores, because of course they didn't have those, but like omnivores who eat meat, to have the highest levels of uric acid. And they did have higher than vegetarians in this study, but they didn't have higher than vegans. And the authors didn't suggest this, and it's just my own speculation. But I think it comes back to that same thing that I mentioned in that other study, where if you're not getting the same level of essential proteins, your glucagon goes up, it causes your gluconeogenesis to go up, and you're basically breaking down your own tissue. And that's what I think is the source. The same thing happens in diabetes. Diabetes is actually characterized by out of control glucagon that's causing you to break down your muscle tissue for energy when it should be getting it from other places. But then the third way that you can have high uric acid, we only see in this transient adaptation to either to fasting or to a ketogenic diet. You get this initial rise in uric acid. And this is actually, if you are prone to gout, this can be a dangerous time. If you're just humming along and then you go on a ketogenic diet, your uric acid levels are going to go up higher in that period. And if you're prone to gout, I would highly recommend that you take potassium citrate or something to
alkalize the urine. Yeah.
Right. But in this case, it's not a matter of purines coming in. It's a matter of the kidney excretion competition. So suddenly your kidney is filled with the normal level of uric acid that you had all along, maybe more if you're also adding more meat. And then ketones, at the same time, they're competing for these transporters to get them out. And so Stephen Phinney has actually suggested that this period which takes maybe around 6 weeks, of which uric acid goes up and then it goes down back to baseline and sometimes actually a little bit lower, that is the true marker of keto-adaptation. When you find that when your uric acid is finally normal again, that's when you're keto-adapted.
Okay, so you're saying you could basically go on a carnivore diet, keto carnivore diet, and you would, and I hadn't mentioned this, but it's just my opinion, but I think a carnivore diet where you're at least in ketosis part of the time, it seems like the ketones would have a protective effect. So that would seem to be the healthiest option. And then your uric acid normalizing is a sign that your body like metabolically has adapted to that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because that was one of my big concerns. I guess the way that I have always kind of thought of like even like a vegan diet, I think there's different landmines out there in a vegan diet. There's obviously been more studies that have been done on plant-based diets than on carnivore diets, but I see them both as kind of like, it's like a playing field that has landmines, and a lot of people are going to go through that whole playing field and not hit a single one of those landmines, and they're going to be fine. But there becomes a greater probability that you're going to hit one of the landmines as these issues kind of come on the table. I think gout and uric acid seems like, again, I know it's a fructose metabolism thing. All the points you're making about, the way it's metabolized in the body and how tissue repair and insulin resistance can cause all this stuff. But it seems like if you're just mainlining the system and then you had a predisposition to begin with, you can end up like that vegetable police kid who, was walking around on crutches on his YouTube channel after going on the carnivore diet for 9 months. Another thing to watch out for, I think, for people out there is even if you don't develop gout, and you have high uric acid. Uric acid inhibits nitric oxide, the creation of nitric oxide in the body, so it could actually cause high blood pressure too.
Right. In fact, one of the earlier theories about why we have high uric acid in the first place, it was because we evolved in a low salt environment. It was in order to keep our blood pressure up, and there's some connection to maybe that would be more important in the transition to bipedalism.
We could go on and on about this for a lot longer, I know. And one of the things I definitely when I come to Boulder, we're going to meet up and have a steak for sure.
Sounds great.
I guess like, what's your final message to the audience in terms of, because you're one of the very original people that was out there with the carnivore diet. You created the Carnivore Diet Conference. What's the framework people can take away from all this conversation about, when to try the carnivore diet and when not to try the carnivore diet? Because my sense of things is it comes down to whether you want the carnivore diet to be included as a nutrition policy. Of course, there's a ton of N=1 success stories, but it's like, for me, I'm not yet ready to endorse it as part of policy, because I don't think there's enough out there kind of showing that it's safe in enough cases. So where you're going to be obviously more favorable in line with it, where would you draw that line?
Well, I have very mixed feelings about policy, and I think that if we're going to build policy around advocating for something, then you need a very high level of evidence. But what I do think is that there are certain types of diseases that we have noticed that people seem to be getting benefit from. Those are autoimmune type diseases, digestive disorders, and psychiatric disorders. And so I think if you have one of those diseases, a carnivore diet is an interesting experiment to try. I don't know, of course, whether it's safe in the long term or what kind of problems we might anticipate. But one thing that I'm quite sure of is that if you try it for 30 days, for example, you're very unlikely to run into a nutrient deficiency or any kind of, problem that you can't recover from. And it could be extremely informative. I want to emphasize that I don't think everyone needs to go carnivore. And I also don't think that that we should be worshiping this pure form of carnivory. Like if I find out that I can regularly have cucumbers and lettuce, and I want to do that, and it doesn't hurt me, or even if it does hurt me and I decide that that's the trade-off I want to take, like there's no shame in that. I don't think all plants are bad. I think that there's no reason to go on an overly restricted diet for preventive ideas that are only speculative. What I do think I would really like to advocate for is that we back off on our assumptions that it's going to be bad for you, and that we acknowledge that a lot of the nutritional ideas that we have that would say that it's bad for you, like the lack of fiber, for example, that we honestly don't have the information to say that it would be bad for you. And what I would love to see is a lot more study that could help us tease those apart. I know that nutritional studies, there's not a lot of incentive to do them, but that's part of why I wanted to organize the conference, is to bring together people to brainstorm about what are the easiest hypotheses to test, and where can we go from here.
You mentioned the conference. So when's the next conference coming up? Where can people find you online? What's your website? All that good stuff.
Oh yeah, thanks for asking. So the next conference is going to be Memorial Day weekend, May 23rd and 24th, here in Boulder again.
Okay.
The tickets are not yet on sale, but the website is up, Carnivore Con, and we're now taking submissions because I really wanted to open it up to the community in the same way that the Ancestral Health Symposium does, in order to bring more voices into the science. So if you have an idea for a research idea that you'd like to present, that's where you should go now.
Okay.
And I have a couple different websites. I should probably unify them at some point, but I have one that I originally made to just talk about very carefully scientifically backed ideas about the ketogenic diet, and that's called ketotic.org.
Okay.
And then I finally got up the courage to talk about this crazy all meat thing that I was doing, and so it's obviously I couldn't back up things that I was talking about in the same scientific way. I could only give ideas. And so I made that site be called Empirica, like empirical, but without the L, and it's a .ca because I'm Canadian.
Okay. So we'll link to both of those.
I'm very active on Twitter. Far too active. Probably I need to give that up. It's such
Twitter
a time
is so
sink,
scary. Talk about YouTube being scary. God, I just don't even Twitter. Oh, I applaud your ability to get in on that.
Well, there are some really interesting conversations there, and so that's why I'm there.
That's true. Well, we really appreciate you coming on and being such a good sport and chatting with us for so long. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the Carnivore Conference in May, and hopefully before then. And just really appreciate your time and your expertise. And thank you for coming on and sharing your story, Amber.
Thank you so much for having me. I likewise really deeply appreciate that you were willing to talk to someone who has some different views from you and some the same, and try to find these points of commonality so that we can move forward together and stop all this senseless he said, she said kind of nonsense.
Couldn't agree more. Very well said. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to kind of highlight individual stories. But thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. The Gene Food Podcast is our attempt to synthesize the latest developments in the fields of genetics, nutrition, and medicine, and offer you practical tips and stories you can use in your own unique health journey. If you enjoy this podcast, you can find more information online at mygenefood.com.